And all of a sudden, his mouth opened wide. He bucked up against the straps, and he was struggling to breathe. He was gasping and gulping. And that went on for an hour and 40 minutes.
That was Dale Bache, a longtime federal public defender who handled dozens of death penalty cases here in Arizona. It would take 2 hours for Joseph Wood to die. Bache witnessed the botched execution 8 years ago at the state prison in Florence. This week, Arizona reopens its execution chamber for the first time since Wood was put to death. And there are still questions about whether the state is ready. The Arizona Republic's Jimmy Jenkins covers the criminal justice beat, and he's been following the run-up to the scheduled execution Wednesday in Florence. Welcome back to Square Off.
Great to be here, Bram. Thanks.
Just first, a little information on the condemned man and his crime. 66-year-old Clarence Dixon is scheduled to be executed Wednesday for a murder he committed 44 years ago. His victim was Dina Bodwin. She was a 21-year-old ASU honors student. She was killed in her Tempe apartment. Her death shattered the family. Now, Republican Attorney General Mark Brnovich announced a year ago he planned to resume executions. Why was there an 8-year break between the Joseph Wood execution and this coming Wednesday?
Well, we just heard about the Joseph Wood execution. It took nearly 2 hours. Media witnesses described, like my predecessor at the Republic, reporter Michael Kiefer, he talked about how when they turned the microphone on, you could hear Wood gasping for air and sucking for air. Afterwards, we found out that the execution, it took DOC 15 times the number of doses that they thought it would to carry out the execution. So after this, the courts issue injunctions which stop the process for several years. They end up ruling that the public has a right to see and hear more during the execution, but they do not have a right to know more about the drugs themselves or the people involved in the process. So then in 2020, the federal government uses a single drug, pentobarbital, a barbiturate, to do a lot of executions at the federal level. Following that, Arizona announces that it has acquired pentobarbital and it's going to go ahead with the single drug protocol. And so that's how we got to this point. And
so new drug and obtaining drugs has been a problem for the last decade, not just for Arizona, but for any state that wants to execute an inmate. And as you point out, much of this is shrouded in secrecy.
That's right.
As I recall, there was a receipt, a $1.5 million invoice.
That's right. It's
for the pentobarbital that Arizona obtained.
State has spent so much money on this. We're putting so many resources into this brand, but we really don't know much about it. It's being done in our name. You mentioned the drugs. So when the state announced it was going to move forward again, the Supreme Court granted, but then threw out briefing schedules last summer for Clarence Dixon and for Frank Atwood. And the reason was because the Department of Corrections first thought that the shelf life of the drug was 90 days, but then they came back and said, oh no, it's actually 45 days. So the state has apparently gone back and done more testing. They applied for and received warrants of execution from the Supreme Court again for Dixon and Atwood, but their attorneys both tell me that they haven't seen enough information to be comfortable that the drugs that are going to be used in the execution will be safe or effective.
And Atwood is a second condemned man who is scheduled to be put to death in June, just keeping with Mark Brnovich's very aggressive schedule. So Dixon's lawyers, they are concerned now. They don't have the information they say they need. Does the state, the Department of Corrections, need to provide that information to them about the expiration date of the drug and its effectiveness?
That's what they're arguing about in the courts right now. I've seen some of these documents. It's very vague. The attorneys for the defendants say they want to know more, like, are there contaminants in these drugs? Are these the actual records that you're showing us? Are these the evaluations of the drugs that you're going to use next week? When was this testing done? They need to know more details, so unless they can, or else they won't feel confident that something like Joseph Wood might happen again.
And I want to ask you about Atwood, because his attorney says, and you've reported this, the state should allow execution by firing squad. Is he serious?
Well, Mr. Atwood's attorneys say that both current options for execution, the gas chamber using cyanide and lethal injection, would cause him a torturous amount of pain. They said he has a spinal condition, and so when he would be restrained to the table for the lethal injection, they say he would be in an excruciating amount of pain. And then they also say, you know, the cyanide gas that's going to be used causes death by asphyxiation, which is you know, people that have witnessed these gas chamber executions in the past, they say it is a gruesome death. You know, the body contorts and spasms for a long time. So they're saying, you know, that is not a viable alternative. And so, yes, they have actually said, you know, if the state could somehow perform it, they think that perhaps a firing squad would be the least painful of all these grim options.
Interesting. The gas chamber, one new execution method introduced since the Joseph Wood execution, which does not require drugs, lethal drugs. Got to end it there. Jimmy Jenkins, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Bram.